Welcome to the Shrine of Remembrance podcast, or vodcast, as we're doing today, exploring all facets of our wartime history. My name is Lee and I'm the Shrine's production coordinator. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, writer Mike Rosel. Mike recently published A Rat of Tobruk, a digger's lost images of the siege, which draws on images captured by Mike's father, Lieutenant John Rosel, behind the lines in Tobruk in 1941. Welcome, Mike, and thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So, Mike, congratulations on the publication of your new book. It's drawn largely from photographs that your father captured in Tobruk. How did you find these photographs?
Well, I always knew he had them. And because I'm his oldest son, and I was born just after he got back from Tobruk, and I felt forever grateful that he came back. And I quizzed him on these things to discover, of course, that very early on he would never talk about combat. Other things, yes. So the albums, which started with his training in northern Victoria and went into Tobruk, he didn't go to the islands afterwards. They were always there. A lot later on, I offered to share them with the War Memorial. They've taken quite a few. And last October, my wife, God bless her, was cleaning up the 44 photo albums that I have inherited as the family historian. And there was a cascade of albums, including father's. I grabbed them and had a soulful moment. And something made me realise, I was seeing how long. Actually, next year is the 40th anniversary of the siege. And there are going to be very few of the diggers still there. We know, well, at least one or two marched or attended this year. And then I realised that all these pictures, beyond the War Memorial ones, would disappear unless someone did something about it. And of course that was Muggins, because I'd already done a family history. And I went to the publisher, Nick Walker, who'd done a book with me a few years ago. He said, look at this. And he said, all right, challenge me to pick out 30 pictures, 30,000 words, see what you get. So I went home, and a lot of it was easy. I had the pictures. All I had to do was turn over 600 pictures and note the ones where he'd written on the back. Some touching stuff there. The pictures are okay. I had to scan the flaming things. I went off and got his wartime record, and that fleshed out a little bit. There's a funny story there later. And of course, I had done an elaborate family history with my brother. We were Gold Rush Germans, and so all of that was done. That was just a case of process. But I realised, of course, that he'd left no diaries, none of his love letters to my future mother. And what we lacked was a human touch. I mean, the pictures that were central, they're great, but what was it like to be on the ground in Tobruk? And that's where I started.
So could you take us to your father's life before the war?
Sure.
What was he doing before he
Okay, well, the family were in Nattamuk, a little town near Horsham, for years, where they had the pub. And, but his father suicided in 1927. And his widow took the 4 kids to Melbourne, and Dad and his brother finished up at Xavier, where he was a very good schoolboy footballer and rower. And then, of course, he left school in the middle of the Depression. Very lucky, because the mother had been confused by a National Bank manager in Nattamuk and had got very bad advice and lost money, and the family knew someone who was a new senior executive in the bank, and the square off was Dad was given a job as a cadet in 1934 in the middle of the Depression, and that's what he did. He served through. He joined the militia in the late 30s and spent a year there, and when everything hit the fan, he joined up the proper army in 1940 and went off to northern parts with the 2nd 24th to learn to become real soldiers.
So the 2nd 24th, they had a very sudden introduction to warfare in North Africa. Could you briefly explain what happened in late April, early May? Okay,
well, like most of Australians' units, they were seriously under-equipped. They sent them out to fight tanks with a thing called a boy's rifle, which was like a rifle on steroids, which might hurt a motorbike. You know, there were no bazookas, nothing. And they were there prepared to be attacked by the panzers, which had already, of course, blown away France and Poland. They had no exposure to things like anti-tank guns and no training with other arms of the service. So they had a lot of guts, but they didn't have much to go with it. And when Rommel chased everybody across the desert, all back into Tobruk, and eventually got his forces together for the real attack, my father's battalion was the area he chose. And of course they were dive bombed by the Stukas, they were machine gunned from the air, shelled, and when the attack came in, after about 2 days, I think from memory, half of the 6 platoons were gone, either dead or captured, and it was a frightful introduction. They'd done what they had to do, they'd stalled them long enough so that when the Germans got onto the second line, they ran into British artillery and they were stopped. So they paid a terrible price for what was their blooding in combat. And that's when he got the Military Cross for basically staying put in their holes in the desert and defying the particular troops opposite them.
And they held those positions for about 6 months before
the siege was about 8 months. He didn't stay as long. He was sent off a year later to train troops, and of course then the Australians left and others came in. But he was there for the critical part of it.
And as you mentioned, one of the key features of your book is this beautiful human touch that the letters of Private Harry Frazer bring to the text. Frazer served in your father's platoon. How did you discover these letters?
By a miracle. I'd got everything else underway when I realised that the battalion history, which I drew on very heavily, was very well done and had quite a few quotes from different stages, and that was essential. But it needed one digger, one to speak for all of them. And through a friend who put me onto a friend at the War Memorial, where I went to the reading room there, where I'd done the previous book, and they pulled out half a dozen folders material from troops in that battalion. And I only had about an hour and a half to go at that stage. Had the camera out, frantically going through these things, nothing. And then I find a fat file, Harry Frazer, 180 letters that he'd written during his army service to his parents in Swan Hill. And he was a very ordinary digger. He was a country boy. When he left school, he joined his father. They had a big hardware store. And ironically, they were also the regional funeral directors, so he knew about death. And he'd written these letters to his folks. They were honest and they were intimate. And it brought tears to my eyes. Excuse me. And in there, I'm madly photographing. I come to a letter in May, yes, a few weeks after the battle. Well, lo and behold, instead of being an ordinary digger among 900 in the battalion, he says, my platoon leader is John Rosel. So I have a witness. And you've seen this stuff. It's lovely. It's not Hemingway. He's not unlettered, but he writes, it's folksy, and he has a lot of commas, and I'll read some of it to you later. It has a cadence of someone, and Mummy did this, and and terribly honest. I mean, a lot of people didn't bother telling their parents that they were scared, or the intimate side of things. They didn't want to upset the parents, may not want to upset the censor. So it was a pleasure to see this bandsman, which he was. He played the cornet in the band. And of course, when everything hits the fan, the bandsmen usually become stretcher bearers. In this case, they gave him his rifle back and go and see Lieutenant Rosel over there. So that's how we found him. At this stage, I'm sort of getting very emotional, saying, well, okay, these letters were filed about, I think, 2005. What happened to Harry Frazer? We have no photographs, we have nothing. Anyway, I go back to Melbourne and make a couple of calls, and lo and behold, His daughter lives a few kilometres away and is thrilled that the letters she provided the memorial are going to find a voice. And very happy to provide some of the pictures to back it up. So that was the miracle of Harry Frazer.
What an extraordinary find.
Exactly, it was really, serendipity is overused, but that was pretty good.
Are you able to share a couple of the passages I can see you?
Sure, let me read from it if I may. I won't bother with the date. He's reporting back to his parents. And this to me is, given that he was quite religious and he thanks God in several cases, but not in the sense you and I would. He really thanked God, because he believed God had been protecting him. So he's writing a while after the battle, when he opened up a bit to his parents. And he's saying, this war is a rotten business and has taken some bonzer chaps that I know and you know, but I must try and keep off that line. I'm glad to have the opportunity to hear Mass tomorrow for the first time in 6 weeks. The best I've been able to do is read my missal each Sunday, and believe me, I've read it in some queer places. One Sunday, perched behind a machine gun, ready to pour lead into the first Hun who showed his head, which really is not a very edifying mixture, but duty is duty, is it not? And I feel now, after some of the things I've seen and heard about the German, by that I mean the leaders, not the poor unfortunate private soldier, who doesn't want the war any more than we do, and is only acting under orders. I feel we're fighting for our freedom and self-respect. So that's a good reaction. I don't mind shooting that off, but I don't really like shooting at these boys. Particularly, of course, Frazer wouldn't have known that stage that some of them might have been called Rosel as well, because they might have been distant relatives. We're all heartily sick of this business and badly need to spell out of it altogether. This is a war of nerves with shelling and dive bombing, and have seen a few bad cases of shell shock. And it's a wonder I haven't been myself at times. It's been that close. It's surprising how afraid one can be before an engagement, and then when he gets into it, he seems to lose all fear. That's my experience anyway, but oh mother, it's horrible, this warfare. Gosh, I'd love a hot bath, some clean clothes and green grass to lay on. It's over 2 months since I had a freshwater wash all over. I'll never moan about a Swan Hill dust storm again when I get back. They haven't to this country. There's no such thing as a tree here, and very little of anything but sand and stone and about 14 million flies per man. It's lovely. My father actually censored his letters, and didn't cut a thing as far as I can see. This is him writing in late June and talking about the actual battle itself. He then moved in to attack us with tanks and very heavily equipped infantry. After that, I have not a very clear recollection of what really happened. There were huge tanks everywhere, swarms of Dagos and Jerrys. The noise was terrific and bullets and shrapnel were flying everywhere. There were 8 of us holding our little link in the chain. We luckily managed to make it a bit too hot for the blighters who came at us. At one time, there were over 200 attacking our little fortress. I honestly have very little recollection of what actually took place. All I know is we stood there and blazed away until at last the enemy retired. Not one of the 8 of us were hit. Between us, we'd stopped easily 100 of the Jerrys. The stretcher bearers were working like blazes all that night and half the following day. Very lucky people. Oh, of course, except the hundreds, yeah.
It's extraordinary.
Still there.
Any of them made it back.
Well, yeah, it was, later on in the war they would have had anti-tank weapons and things like that, which might have made it a little less violent. But the interesting thing is that this was like a naval battle. It happened out, there was nothing but dirt. Mm. And, very little collateral casualties, practically none. And the main German army obeyed, the conventions of war. And there are plenty of stories in that about, the tank would move up and it'd blow all these little rocky heaps to bits, and they'd fling a few grenades, and eventually they'd have to surrender. And the German officer would come up and say, you've been very well. They'd come back, and they would prevent other troops from souveniring and things. So they were very, like hundreds of them were taken prisoner. Well, they didn't have any choice. Of course, that was not the scene in the Pacific.
I guess the catalyst for your book was the discovery of these photographs.
Rediscovery.
And they really paint an extraordinary picture of the life that the men were leading in Tobruk. There's photographs where you can see the landscape that they were living and fighting in, but there's also really beautiful portraits and intimate photographs of them at moments of rest or relaxation. How did you choose? How did you?
Well, it was 600. He didn't have the equipment, the access, the propaganda angle of the professional photographers who did record the siege later on. These were pictures for his mates, and they, of course, took pictures of him. They all sent them home to their families and friends. So obviously, the martial ones, no combat scenes. No one had combat scenes in Tobruk. It didn't happen. So, for instance, this one of my favourites. It's on the cover of the book. There he is, and it's unposed. Someone probably snatched that picture. He's having a yak on the phone. There he is. He's probably talking about the Melbourne Football Club back in Melbourne. But look, that's there he is. It's a digger at work. You can see the cables for the field telephones, which never worked when you really needed them. And you had another one, which is on the book, which is, to me, is a great picture. He's looking very reflective. He's not looking, he doesn't have his hat on. On the back of the picture, he's put, thinking of your pet. Sorry, we'll try again. On the back of it, he's put, thinking of you, pet. This is my mother, future mother. And this one, this is his Batman, his orderly. And, this is not a martial digger. This is probably looks like a pretty young bloke, looking a bit embarrassed and shy. And the Germans got him at El Alamein. So you look, there are pictures in here, of course, from the journey. They all went to Cairo and said, "Oh, look, women in veils." They were ockers on the highway, and they spoke about dagos and wops and the language of the time. But he told me later on, my mother had a beautiful woven wire brooch, and he said he saw it looked like a 10-year-old who'd done it, and he didn't like the way that child labour was exploited in Cairo and other places. So look, it was just a mix. Groups of officers, people, him sitting in a bath in the desert having a scrub, just a range of things to suggest the life they lived. There's a nice shot of it'd be really the section. The platoon was typically divided into 3 sections, maybe 10 men. Foxhole there. And there's a shot of them having their lunch in the desert, and 2 of them looked like extremely bronze diggers. They'd got the Tobruk tan, and they look like not a pack of whackers, but look like a ruffians for our service. They were very relaxed, and of course half the time they didn't bother with their shirts. It was dreadful. Okay, this is one of the 2 albums he presumably bought in the bazaar at Cairo, and I'll get you some of the best pages. This one is, in terms of quantity and quality, is one of the best. There they are, they're in their trenches, post S10 in Tobruk. There he is, of course, the field telephone, the man whose troops relieved him when they went looking to see if they'd survived. There's a bit of a corny one. There's the digger. He's just been trying to dig his trenches a little better. His Batman, you can see close up his soul is a bit worn out. And some of the guys, this man at least, died at El Alamein.
So did he write the names of
the
men in the photographs?
Yeah. I'm not sure, he must have sent them home to Lorna, because half of them got messages on the back. The cover photograph he's got on the back, "This is my home up here, darling." So the pictures chose themselves. It hurt to have not to put more in. I did talk him into about 10 more. And in other circumstances, you know, there are more to be seen. But they, given that they're all very small, as you can see from the albums, they're all about this small. And mercifully, the desert light usually gave plenty of pictures, so by the time you scanned them, you know, you got useful images. So
they're a beautiful and moving illustration of their lives. You know, they're very evocative of. Well,
that's right. You know, scrubbing dishes in the dirt, and all this. There's a quote there from Harry Frazer saying he hadn't had a full wash down with clean water for 2 months. You know, it was. Yeah, they all lost weight, and they all had desert sores, but they're a lot better off than some of their guys who had to serve later in the Pacific. Yeah.
And they went on to serve in the Pacific as well?
Yes, yeah, the battalion served in the Pacific. The father had been hived off to train troops back in Australia at that stage, and he rejoined the battalion when they went to Tarakan at Borneo at the very end of the war, a battle which some figured need never have been done, but that's another issue. In that case, his file was marked LOB, and I asked my good friend and military mentor, Dr. Mark Johnston, what did that mean? Lucky old bastard? And he gave me the look and said, left out of battle, because these were the senior officers that were left behind to recreate the battalion. They had heavy casualties. So there he is, left out of battle, and the war ends. And at this stage, he survived the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, desert and jungle, and he gets invalided home with piles, hemorrhoids, or as a poet probably put it, the war ended with a pain in the arse.
So growing up, did you know much about your father's wartime experiences? Were you aware of where he'd served?
Well, I was, he came back in May to Australia in May 42. He married Mum a week later at Xavier Chapel. I arrived 10 months later. He didn't fool around, my father. And of course I was the oldest, and growing up you'd see these things and you knew he was a hero, and occasionally people would say things and you'd ask, you know, what happened, Dad? But he wouldn't talk about it. And he would talk about the kids in the desert or the Libyan beggars or funny stories or how hard it was to keep his razor sharp, but never about combat. And I was asthmatic and I used to read like mad, so I read an awful lot of military stuff. I immediately realised that they didn't talk about it. And even years later, when we were in maybe driving somewhere quietly, you'd edge around to it and he'd dodge away. So me and my brothers and sisters knew that he was quiet on that. We knew what he'd done to the extent of the citation and the references in some of the books, but not what happened when a boy raised on the 10 Commandments was told to forget about the one about killing people. You know? So that kept us interested. After the war, he came back. He was a bank officer, had 6 kids. He was pretty frugal there for a while. I remember we tried to air dry sliced beans on his army poncho. That didn't go so well. And he was really a good human being. He was a great father. And his mantras were common sense, you know, it was a part of the do unto others, you know, and fair play, fair go. But he practiced it. He used to tell us, I can't give you much money, but I can show an example. And he'd say, now, Michael, there's Mum's fruitcake. There are 9 of us at table, including Grandma. You cut it, yes, Dad, and you'll have the last slice. So all these little lessons. Unfortunately, his only vice was the ciggies. And of course they did in those days. And his pipe. He was a bank manager, a picture of rectitude with his pipe and his hat. And he never stopped smoking, and they got him 40 years after combat. So Rommel didn't get him, but the Craven A did. And that was very hurtful. He saw pretty much all the grandchildren, but not for long. So yes, we really missed him. He was only 64 at that stage. but he'd set a good example. When he got home, he took us to a couple of battalion picnics, and that was good fun. And big men would pat us on the head and say nice things about our father, which I can't remember now. But to my knowledge, he never went RSL or anything, even Anzac Day. He didn't drink beer. He'd have a glass of sherry with Grandma. There was a ritual every Sunday night. Friends had come around to play cards. And this was the only memento, military memento, on display in the house because it was useful. And they'd sit there, and he'd liberated this obviously from Shepherd's, the famous hotel in Cairo, which was officers only during the war. So he took one home. So somehow it's survived twice the length of time that he did. Now I'll have to make sure it gets home safely to the next generation.
This is a beautiful and moving tribute to your father. Congratulations on this book. It really is just a stunning reflection of, I think, their lives. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Shrine of Remembrance podcast. A Rat of Tobruk, a digger's lost images of the siege, is available for purchase through the Shrine shop. Links are in this episode's show notes. On behalf of the Shrine of Remembrance, I thank Mike Rosel for his generosity in sharing his father's story with us, and the Victorian Government for their support of today's episode. Thank you.